without going back into the last episode where we spoke about the breakdown of communication, I'll leave that there for people to go find for themselves. But the breakdown as it's happened within Protestant thought, it's been largely accidental, Bartley says. Something that Protestants slowly fumbled and stumbled their way into. And one of the great challenges of this is once you do have a breakdown of communication of the kind within the church itself, then there is a pathway that's been opened up. And that pathway is towards authoritarianism, or at least authoritarian attitudes. And Bartley thinks that they are flourishing today within the faith. How does this happen? Well, you can kind of see it. Once you have no commitment to irrationality, or at least no responsibility to be rational, then what is holding you back as a leader of this faith, for example? It's easy to roll back into authoritarianism and say that a lot of the failures or the mistakes or the decline of Protestantism has come about from the abandonment of those irrational presuppositions, which traditional Protestantism based itself on, and that those presuppositions were true, and then that all rational argument about those presuppositions, or as Bartley calls them, those ultimate commitments that are beyond rationality, are impossible. Society then gets splintered, of course, into irreconcilable groups, the rational and the irrational, and you find a resurgence in Protestant theology that openly advocates a non-rational, non-liberal means to grow the faith and propagate those presuppositions. Some of this, of course, rolls back to Bartley's earliest chapter, where he speaks about the alienation and the confusion that he sees out there in the world, and how this is tied into crises of integrity and then identity, or the other way around, of course. Just what the Christians and the Protestant faith says about themselves as a matter of identity, and then how well they live up to that as a matter of integrity. To live in a crisis of integrity is to live in bad faith or bad conscience. And living in bad faith and bad conscience, it makes sense that the step you might take is to repudiate the otherness, is the phrase he uses here, which is to take an intolerant stand, a totalitarian stand, an authoritarian stand, and to feel comfort in taking such a stand, because you see so many other groups out there in society doing just the same thing. You see the intolerance within the rational tradition itself. Bartley thinks, as in most things when it comes to rationality, that to understand Protestantism, and particularly this strain of Protestantism, you learn a lot about rationality. And so we ought to be able to understand just how authoritarian has crept back into Protestantism, and it's moved further away from what it once claimed for itself to be liberal and rational. And first off, it ought to be said that a lot of the attacks, the traditional attacks that Protestantism has had upon Catholicism, it's done so by claiming that Catholicism is itself an authoritarian attitude. It's anti-democratic. The hierarchy and some of the tendencies within Catholicism is what they don't like and what they consider to be antithetical to Christianity. And yet a lot of these attacks are simply because there's a difference about the role of religion in people's lives and what it should play. It's not really an attack on authoritarianism. It's an attack on a different faith, and authoritarianism is a useful tool to do that. So let's move on to the Protestant faith and contemporary Christians. And Bartley does so by beginning with what he considers a certain veil that has been drawn between the mass of the Protestants themselves and the problems of Protestantism. He says it hasn't always been here, this veil, this curtain, but it's been drawn now. It goes something like this, that when an individual begins to have doubts about their faith or some particular element of the faith, that they ought to leave it to their ministers to decide just how serious that doubt is, whether it can be refuted, whether they can be talked out of it, or whether the minister has a question on their hand, whether they move that person from the faith to a kind of inner circle which is sanctified against the rest. For those people in the inner circle, the myth is broken. The veil has been drawn around them. The rest on the outside, the line goes something like this: let the ignorance of the innocent prevail. Let them have it. But if you find yourself in deep doubt, deep enough doubt, that you really are challenging and dealing with these issues of rationality, then we'll happily let you into the inner faith, the inner circle here, where no one is pretending anymore, and where people act incredibly like atheists, while still going on to believe that it's important that the faith continues for the rest. Now, this seems a fairly obvious move that a lot of faith does have. It seems somewhat in various levels that this happens again and again and again. But what's been left behind and what is actually there underneath it all, it really does matter. You're saying, in a sense, that there is differences between different people and the different ideas that they have. And that some people, the ones that you led into that inner circle, for example, are literally beyond the reaches of theological interpretation. They're broken free. And no matter how much we try to talk them back into the faith, the issues they have, we're not going to be able to answer. And yet there are multiples more who we can always talk back into the faith if they're having doubts, or won't have enough significant doubts in the first place to make this an issue. So on this basic level, you have your breakdown of communication. It's unavoidable, is it not? These two sides, yeah, they are cooperating with each other, but one is keeping a deadly quiet secret while thinking something about the other that is incredibly patronizing. And yet they're doing so because if they were truthful, they know there'll be ramifications for themselves and ramifications for their faith. Some of what this takes us back to for Popperian years is Plato and the great authoritarianism that Popper thought Plato had at the heart of his philosophy. There's a royal lie, that's a quote here, that is written into the Republic and the Laws, 2 books of Plato's, which allows for rulers, once they're in power and once they've decided what is good for the state itself, to introduce any myth that they like, which is designed to improve the society or prevent social change and social mobility. They're allowed to do so, even though they don't believe the lie themselves. It's good for everybody else. The great mistake that Plato is making here, and what this new Protestant movement towards authoritarianism is making, is the claim that not all people are particularly intelligent, or most people are not. But we're not after intelligence here. I mean, it doesn't say much to say that the people around you are not smart or bright. What you're after is rationality. And everyone is capable of rationality, capable of pursuing truth, discovering error, and improving things. You show me the person who isn't capable of creating a conjecture and then refuting that conjecture, and you'll show me a person who is irrational. That person doesn't exist. Consider, for example, a particular story that Bartley wants to tell here. And he says this is the life of a particular believer that he has in mind. He says, imagine this person being taught the Bible, all the stories, and claimed to be truth, as it always is, and this person has no doubt about it in their minds, period. This person grows up to be a believer and a devout believer. They then go away to college, or they read a book, or they discover some particular bit of information, and this produces difficulties for their religious faith. They have a conflict of sorts. This conflict not only jeopardizes their belief system, but also their mental health in a way, and the balance of themselves as a person. Everything they believe to be true and valuable is now teetering on the edge of something. It's in danger. And the new Protestant minister then comes along, discovers the problem, and says to this person that, after all, don't worry, all these Christian stories, well, they're not really true. They're just symbolically true. They're just symbols and nothing else. And I've known this all along. A lot of us have known this all along. That's what I mean every time I preach about these symbols. And he's saying something along the lines of, I'm wise enough to realize that a lot of this is wrong, or most of this is wrong. And there's a huge contradiction, or many contradictions, in the heart of the enterprise. And yet, I'm wise enough to know that if I were to bring these to light and open them up, the whole enterprise might fall. So why would I do that? And this is a kind of comfort that's trying to be offered here to this young man or this young woman. Don't stress, don't worry. All those things you believe to be true, literally true, are now symbolically true, which is just as good, is it not? Of course, you can see the harm that has been done to this young person, and the harm that's also been done to the faith itself and what it claims about itself, the integrity of the faith itself. There's also an incredibly harsh, as you must have seen, authoritarianism. You decide what is best for the people around you, and you don't let them have access to the truth. What a lot of these ministers and people who advocate such a deception, such a contradiction, don't often see is the harm that has been done to these men and women when they discover such a thing has actually happened. It crushes them. The discovery shatters them. And the whole world that they once thought to be true and important begins to break down. And the casual way in which the people who built the world up say, yes, of course it never existed, is a greater harm as well. It's magnified. Now, who knows what the overall harm to the individual actually is in this? How much mental breakdown and mental disorder actually is caused by this? The discovery that all you've been taught in your adolescence or throughout your life was in fact not true, despite being told that it was. And everyone telling you these things knew that it was, and had never had any intention of telling you otherwise. They were going to let you go on believing this forever. Whenever you see an urge like this within someone, the urge to say, I know what is best for another person, and to do so, I'm going to keep this person unconscious to the truth, prevented from it, simply because if I think they had access to it, they would make too many errors and too many mistakes. Well, you've got a particularly insidious form of authoritarianism happening there. The great challenge for Protestantism is just that pursuit of truth, that rationality. It is in the business of selling a product, and yet truth and the search for truth is not a product. It cannot be bought and sold in the way you might think, or might hope, sorry. Bartley has an analogy here which might be helpful. He says, when you go to search after the truth, it's like when you begin to scale a mountain, and this mountain is of infinite height. It is not possible for any climber to ever reach the height of this mountain, the top, summit, no more so than it would be for a mathematician to ever count all the numbers in existence, or could possibly exist. And yet, as you stand below the mountain and look up, you think it's an incredibly attractive thing to try and conquer. And you can see other men and other women up there climbing, trying to conquer it, with different types of equipment and different types of techniques, and you think perhaps they've got it all wrong. Perhaps I can change what they're doing slightly and get to the top of that mountain. The fact that other mountain climbers have tried this and they've all failed, no one's ever got to the top, well, that's not something to be disappointed about for many people. Those people that actually failed, yeah, sure, they are disappointed themselves. But you'll get there. You'll know better if you can just figure this thing out. And yet, as you start to climb, you realize the whole thing looked better from the bottom. As you get there, it's actually quite hard and quite difficult. This mountain is incredibly painful to try and struggle to the top of. The winds are cold, it's snowy, and the warm sunlight you saw from the bottom is merely an illusion. And then you begin to get a bit of self-pity. You have self-pity for the people at the bottom who don't know what you know yet. You look down at them and you say, well, if only they knew what I knew. Those poor people down there. They really are better off where they are. Better off before they started trying to climb. At least when they were down there, they could have the expectation that they could have had truth in their hand and the top of the mountain was achievable. But once I'm here on the mountain, I realize the problems we have and the impossibility of ever getting to the summit. And so in Bartley's analogy, the people climbing this mountain, the people who have discovered the pains and suffering of it, the people who are envious of the ones who have not tried to get to the top yet, they build a cloud factory of a sort to obscure the summit itself and obscure the mountain itself, simply for the good of the people below. Say there is nothing to climb. You have already achieved it. There's a poem here that Bartley decides to leave things off with. I'm not going to read the whole thing, simply because I don't think the whole thing is particularly good. But the last part is important. He says, do not limp before the lame and deem it as kindness. I think that's the point here. And Bartley is also a great diagnostician of education and education systems. His next book is largely about that. In fact, when he arrives with Popper as a very young man, what he notices in Popper is the honest attitude that Popper takes towards him. He remembers speaking to Popper and saying, I knew I had his full attention. There would never be any pretense here. There's no career goals, no climbing of any ladders, simply honest and straightforward conversations. He said he hadn't had that for a long time in his life, and he recognized immediately the quality he had with Popper. And yet this limping before people attitude is what Bartley sees within most education today. And even when Bartley was alive, I'm sure it still survives a lot of it, where people try to control the future by conditioning the young people, the students, towards a particular type of future and to compromise their attitudes. It comes about from people who are frustrated with the present and so in trying to control the future. The claim on a larger scale goes a little bit like this. Whenever you discover self-doubt or hesitation or anxiety or a lack of commitment or disagreement within the culture around you, this could be a country or a culture, then the tendency for most people is to adopt a certain kind of attitude and an ideology. This could be a form of Christianity or it could be a form of rationalism. And what it encourages you to do is compromise on the future to correct the hesitation and anxiety and suffering that you are having today. Bartley's got no time for this, and I don't think rationalists should either. But I think Bartley is onto something here as well, that this is what a lot of rationalists do, is what the rationalist tradition does. I mean, it is difficult to see, and this is a point that Bartley makes. He thinks of the Protestant theologian, the person who maintains that the future, when and if it does come, will be Christian and will be a display of Christian theology. He thinks it's hard to imagine how this person can't be accused of exactly the same kind of intellectual pride that those same theologians would accuse non-Christians of having, and the same error they would be making. So let's wind things back to hard details here a little. What Bartley is looking at in terms of the Protestant faith is that they have embraced a kind of philosophical contention. That is, that rationality is logically limited. It must be. And that no matter who you are, no matter what your faith, you make an irrational commitment, an ultimate irrational commitment. And that is because people for throughout the whole rational tradition, including up to critical rationalism and including critical rationalism, couldn't see any other way. What Bartley is saying is there's no longer any excuse for this. It shouldn't be done. Bartley has solved the problem. We can and ought to shift the emphasis from a justificationist rational argument into one that's completely non-justificational and entirely based on criticism. It's an argument that doesn't force anyone to be a rationalist. It only shows that there is no reason, no logical reason to be an irrationalist. And how should one act if they really are a rationalist? Well, the rationalist should act in a way in which they show commitment neither to rationalism itself or to any other belief system. He doesn't need to denigrate or repudiate people who disagree with him. He gets to act towards them in a fairly remarkable and novel way. There's never any criticism, never any doubt, which he thinks is beyond the pale. Criticism is what matters, and you can take it wherever you like. It's simply been the case that tu quoque argument, the argument for hypocrisy, has been allowed to stand unchallenged within the rational community. It was possible for much too long for a rational man to build up and defend an irrational commitment, and to do so without damaging or denigrating his integrity in any way as a rationalist. The pancritical rationalist, Bartley's pancritical rationalist, looks at himself as he does to other people. He says his own theory must be riddled with errors. It must be full of them. It must have inconsistencies. And who best to find those inconsistencies than the irrationalists, the people who feel identified with the opposite set of beliefs. If you're going to be a pancritical rationalist, and I do think you ought to be, it makes no claims that it can't hold on to. It recognizes at the core of all things that rationality is completely unlimited. Despite that, it is also completely prone to error. There's a phrase that Popper once used that people like to quote, and they think it's the core of critical rationalism, which goes something like, I may be wrong and you may be right, and yet through argument and discussion we can get closer to the truth. Bartley's got a twist on this. He says, I may be wrong and you, even you, a poor irrationalist, may be right. I think that's the claim you have to really dig into here, really embrace. That you have to be open to the idea that the irrationalist might be right, or you're yourself being an irrationalist. What sets you apart from them? Sure, you may not conceive that it could happen, but on what grounds are you denying the possibility that it could happen? If what you're hoping for is criticism and to learn from your mistakes, then what you're hoping for is criticism. You don't get to presuppose and prejudge what that criticism looks like. And why would you want to? The point is, even if irrationalists often behave badly, is to treat them not as they treat us, but rather as we would want them to treat us. If we do this, it is only us that gains any profit. It's only us that gains anything. And I think the rationalist tradition has looked at this in the opposite for way too long and thought if we behave like this, what happens is we fail and they rise. I don't think it's true. I think the inverse is true. So does Bartley. The object is to learn, not to win debate. And we ought to take our opponents' arguments seriously, to refute them and to then reject them if they're wrong, but not to reject them out of hand before they've even been mentioned, and to do so as a matter of principle. It doesn't matter whether they reciprocate or not. Every time we get criticism, we're learning, and we're learning more about ourselves and our own theories. It doesn't matter where the criticism comes from, or how genuine it is or not. Maybe your opponent is simply trying to win the debate. Doesn't mean you have to. Your goal can be to learn, even if everyone else's isn't. Now, there's a last point to touch on here, and I'm not sure how necessary it is, but there's a claim here. And I think it was a claim that was also leveled towards the critical rationalists as well. It's one that comes up a bit when you make a move like Bartley is making here. And that is, we used to have something that was warm and loving, and then pancritical rationalism has come along. And all we have is a ruthless policy to follow. Whereas before we had a love and commitment, we just have something cold and unpleasant. But if we subject those things that we love and committed to, if we subject them to criticism and therefore endanger them, what could possibly happen? One, it survives and we get to keep the love we have, the things that we love and are committed to. One, they fail and we recognize we were wrong all along, in which case, wouldn't you want to know this? It is a sorry kind of love that anyone has if they're unwilling to take risks with it, unwilling to let it be blind. Anyone so scared of losing love of this kind, of losing something that they deeply care about, and therefore protecting it, is making a much larger mistake. There's a certain kind of love that leads you into becoming an authoritarian, one that subordinates the requirements of human beings to the claims of the ideas that you already hold, and you demand that those things that you love formulate themselves in a way that match the idea. You make demands of objects in the world and of people. Bartley says the world is full of people who like to say that they love humanity. I believe that's probably true today as it was in Bartley's day. And the line is often that there's not enough people who think this way, who have this love for humanity and love for the world. Bartley thinks the opposite. He thinks there's too many people who think this way. That's the problem. And it's just the kind of love they have is an authoritarian love. The type that imposes itself, restricts, and is dangerous to the people and the things that it claims to love. Love is not a commodity. It shouldn't be treated as such. Now, you can call it love or you can call it respect. Bartley, at different points in this book, calls it both. But the real point is this: if you really are to love someone or to respect someone, the most prima facie way of noticing that that love is real and that respect is real is to take their views seriously, not to be fearful of what those views are. And I think that's the essence of pancritical rationalism as well. It does its absolute best to take seriously the views of other people and all criticism, wherever it comes, wherever it may lead. It's not a rationalism that condemns others for not being as it is. It doesn't draw hard lines and distinctions between science and pseudoscience, or science and metaphysics, or religion and non-religion, or rationality and irrationality. It welcomes irrationality into the enterprise, as long as irrationality is bringing criticism. What matters is criticism, and only that. And the only thing that makes you a rationalist is that openness. The minute you close it off in any way, the minute you try and protect something, you become an authoritarian, and you're losing your rational identity, which Bartley wishes we wouldn't, because really, at the heart of it, he doesn't think we have anything to fear. It's a fear that we've manufactured ourselves.